Hi, I'm Patricio Treviño.
Hi, I'm Matias Montemayor.
This is our podcast where we're gonna be talking about the parallels between the trial scene in A Thousand Suns and the trial in the short story A Jury of Her Peers. There are
So,
many.
so I think that the two trials are very similar, like in paper. You could say that both trials are, well, they are about a woman who killed her husband, and both stories are told from the accusee's point of view, and like they make the reader sympathize with the woman and make us feel like she was justified for killing her husband in both cases. Oh, what do you think?
I disagree that they're similar on paper, because on paper they're very different. But if you analyze them, you can tell they have many similar ideas, mainly about the different roles of women and men in societies.
Um, yeah, I can see that. I think that both stories like at their core have very similar themes. They have like misogynistic themes in the sense that both juries are filled with men, and even though they take place in two like completely different societies in different parts of the world, we can see how the inequality of women and the misogyny that men have against them are two very prevalent themes in both of the stories. Uh, like, for example, us as the reader, we know why the woman did what they did, killing their husbands. In like we can understand in Miriam's case, for example, that Rashid was going to kill her and Layla if she didn't kill him first. So as the reader, we kind of know that that was self-defense, and while the jury doesn't know that, they fail to understand that they like in the end they make the decision of they like without sympathizing without them or without really knowing what they both lived through. uh, they have the power to sentence them to whatever they see fit, and in Miriam's case it's death, like public execution. And I think that's very powerful. And I don't like I don't know, I just feel like both of the cases are very similar in that sense.
I think you're right, and I also like to see how it's very similar, even though they take place in different parts of the world. The women like help each other, like in the short story. The women hid the corpse of the parrot because they knew it would be used as evidence against the woman, and so they wanted to help her. And similarly to Miriam, every woman that was in jail with her saw her as a hero because she did what they were too afraid to do themselves.
I completely agree, and I think that like for example, Miriam was standing up for Lila to Rashid, and in the short story, um, the wives of the investigators were actually protecting the murderer or the woman, and I think in both cases it's very clear that women are like working with each other, and they understand that in those societies they are seen as less than men, and so I think it's very significant that they work together, even like they work together to stand up to the men.
I also think it's very different. Like, there are similar situations, but the reason that Miriam killed her husband was in self defense and to protect the ones she loved. But it was very different on how, in the short story, the woman killed the man, even though she probably suffered. She wasn't seeing someone she loved die, it was just a bird, which could be seen as something less important. And so when they're trying Miriam, I think it's important that they try to see that she was doing it in self defense, even though the judges don't acknowledge that.
I agree to you to an extent, but I think that like all of it's subjective. Like objectively, you can say that the bird is less, but maybe that bird meant a lot to the woman, and maybe her husband killing that bird was like the final straw of something. Like we don't really know. We know. We know that Rashid mistreated Miriam and Layla like throughout the whole story, seeing that the trial was in the third act of the book and towards the end, so we can sympathize with her and we know all her story, but we don't really know the backstory that the woman in the short story has with her husband. And so I don't think that we can properly judge what she did.
I see your point. I also think it's really important to see it as how in the short story we don't see most of the trial. We only see investigation into the trial, and we don't actually have any confirmation of who killed the man, Mr. Wright. But there's very strong suspicion that it was his wife. However, in A Thousand Splendid Suns, we know that Miriam killed Rashid and she confesses to it before she got sentenced to death.
Uh, well, yeah, I agree with that, but I think that it's important to know that both of, even though we don't know that the woman was the one who killed her husband in the short story, like I think it's pretty clear that she did, just because of everything that was happening with like the wives of the investigators helping her out and all of that, and the whole bird thing. But I think I just don't think we can like know for sure because we don't really know the backstory behind how the relationship of the husband and the wife was, as well as we do in A Thousand Splendid Suns.
I see your point because there's a lot more depth to it in a novel than there is in a short story. But from how the main character analyzes the whole situation in the short story, you get some idea of how they can relate to that of women having no important role.
Yeah, I agree with you on that point. Um, another thing that I think is very similar in both stories is that we see the condition in which the accusees lived under, like physically, not well, we do see emotionally on A Thousand Splendid Suns, but more so in the short story, when they're investigating, we get a sense of the place that they both lived in, and we also get a sense of that in A Thousand Splendid Suns. Throughout the chapter, they describe what the jail was like, what it looked like, what it felt like, and what it was to live under that. And I think that's very important to both stories.
Yeah, I think the author of A Jury of Your Peers does a really good job of using the setting to further the story because from the beginning you can tell that a sane woman like the protagonist, she liked to keep everything neat, and whenever she started something she would finish it. But on the contrary, Mrs. Wright, she probably would lived scared or nervous of something because of how her husband treated her, and that's why she left things half finished compared to finishing them.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and I think that in both stories, like also in A Thousand Splendid Suns, I think that both authors did this intentionally, and I think it was a very interesting and crucial part to how they told the story that they told in these the short part of A Thousand Splendid Suns and the whole story on A Jury of Her Peers. In conclusion, I think that while both stories may be like a little different, I think that both have the same.
We had technical difficulties with the recording software. Back now.
Um, yes, so as I was saying before, while both stories may be like maybe a little bit different, they both have very similar themes of misogyny and of working together as a group in terms of the woman in the story, and they also have the theme of the jury not really understanding the whole situation behind the accusation and the nature of the conflict and of the murder on both stories. What do you think?
I think that both stories job of presenting these issues, especially when you see them in different sides of the world. One with a culture you don't really know, but one with a culture you do know, even if it's a bit more old timey than it is right now.
Yeah, I think that the Western culture in A Jury of Her Peers and the Afghan culture in A Thousand Splendid Suns, I think they while being very drastically different, I think at its core, in terms of women like in this specific example of them being judged by men and being accused of something they did and then being sentenced, well, in A Thousand Splendid Suns, being sentenced to death, with like even though she had a justification, which the men refused to hear. I think like when compared, these two stories show that at its core, both societies have the same misogynistic views, even if it may be like more intense and more clear on A Thousand Splendid Suns.
Thank you for listening to our analysis of two very similar but different stories.
And that would be all. Thanks.